Hello and welcome to Down to Earth with Terry Virts, where we talk about what matters down here on planet Earth. If you love the podcast, please like us and subscribe. And this is the first podcast of 2023 that we're doing. I'm very excited to have Mark Mills. He's been on here a few times, but Mark, I have a special introduction for you today. And we're going to talk today. I really want to focus on robotics and AI. We'll talk about energy. We'll see where it goes. But have you heard about ChatGPT?
Oh, yes, of course I have.
So
Of course
I got an account and I
Okay.
asked it how I should introduce you.
Okay, I'm holding my breath. I was gonna do something similar to you, but go
Oh,
ahead.
man. Well, I told you I had a surprise. So this is what AI would say about Mark Mills. Actually, I haven't read the whole thing. I just typed it in. Mark Mills is a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute, where he focuses on energy and technology policy. He is also a co-founder and CEO of Digital Power Group, a technology advisory and investment firm. Miles is a member of the advisory board of the Energy Policy Institute at the University of Chicago and has served as a technology advisor to the U.S. Department of Energy prior to his. Wow, it has a lot to say about you. Let's see, you were at Northwestern, McCormick School of Engineering, consultant to Fortune 500, prolific writer and speaker. It wrote a lot.
Well, I think all the hype over ChatGPT is well deserved because
Yeah,
we might be on the verge of crossing a Rubicon of
right.
usefulness. I've been writing for a long time about the fact that computing, by and large, still today, to use the technical word, right, sucks. It's the interface is lousy. It requires typing,
Right.
which is stupid. The semantic interface is lousy. Siri voice and Alexa, pretty good, but that's why all the jokes about it. And Chat GPT is a significant step towards a better tool interface. So, but it's a good example of a stunt, right?
Right.
I mean, engineers love stunts. And this is
Right.
why we launched the aviation age with a stunt. And for those, you may have read the book about Guggenheim. If you think you might have, I might have talked about it.
Yeah.
So there's a book, it's about a year and a half old, about Guggenheim, which is, who knows about. Here's what I didn't know about Guggenheim. A lot about his. This is about Guggenheim, the son of the patriarch for which the famous museum and art gallery is named. The son is responsible personally for what we would call the modern U.S. and global commercial aviation industry because of the stunt that he convinced Eddie. My brain just do a. The first transatlantic flight.
Yeah, Lindbergh.
The
Charles
stunt
Lindbergh,
that he
yeah.
convinced Charles Lindbergh to
Yeah.
engage in post-transatlantic flight, which was financed by Guggenheim, which is the barnstorm of the United States, to convince people that aviation was viable, feasible, and interesting. It was just and that stunt is what stimulated the U.S. Congress to take action, the military to take action. All kinds of things came from that stunt. And
Right.
of course, we're talking about 1920-ish, right?
Right.
When this was going on. You couldn't buy a ticket for a reasonable price to fly across the Atlantic in 1920. So
Right.
we were a ways away from really useful aviation.
Right.
But that stunt kicked it off in a sense, because stunt was possible because the state of the technology made the stunt possible. But there
Right.
were a lot of things that didn't exist then. Guggenheim was responsible for our weather service. The only way
Wow.
he knew that aviation would be viable is if you could not only predict but make it easy to have a agnostic service that told you the weather in another city in advance, a prediction. Because if you flew a plane, you're a pilot, especially in those days, you'd want to know what the weather was going to be like on your route and where you were going to go.
Right.
Nothing like that existed prior to Guggenheim. And Guggenheim financed and created that service and then handed it off and was responsible for Congress creating the National Weather Service in order to make aviation possible. So the relevance of that, and there's other examples in history, is that stunt was possible because of the state of technology being at a pivot. AI, computing in the cloud, the utility of asking a question like you did, and as you know, you didn't have to type it in. You could have said to your phone, you could have said, how should I introduce Mark Mills? And it would have done the same thing. Now, so what it does is it scrapes up everything about me on the internet because it's a search engine, and then uses semantic rules to write text that is grammatically correct. And it's a pretty cool stunt. I mean, people have had a lot of fun with that stunt. Now,
Hmm.
it got some things sort of wrong because it didn't do the order of things. Digital Power Capital doesn't exist as an operating fund anymore. It's not on my current bios, is what I do now. It's in
Right.
my history in a longer
Right.
bio, which is at my website, techpundit.com. So there's a long bio there for people who want the whole schmear, which most
Hmm.
people don't. So I mean, it's a great stunt, and there's a really good article about the visual, the graphic version of this. I think it's in Wired magazine. Sorry, I forgot the name of the artist. A Polish artist, does great fantasy art for fantasy and science fiction, and his stuff is copied all the time, emulated. And if you want to get a drawing of, say, a modern fighter pilot fighting a dragon in the style of X, right? You can ask
Right.
GPT to do that. It'll produce a really cool image. And the essay in Wired magazine talked about really how both impressive it is and how far away it still is from being creative because it's scraping other people's creativity.
Right.
Uh, so anyway, long way of saying
That's interesting.
I'm all over it. I'm with you on this.
It's a good stunt. Yeah, yeah,
A
yeah.
great stunt.
The New York Times Daily podcast had a thing a couple weeks ago. This is what got me on a Chat GPT. And another thing you can do is have it write the biography of Mark Mills in Shakespearean style,
Exactly.
or in
Or
gangster 1940s gangster style, or right.
right, right. You can do the same with images. I want it to paint a picture of me in the style of Matisse or a
Right.
pointillist, or I'd like to have it. So you can do this fun stunt. Write me a poem in the style of
Yates, or
Yeats
yeah,
or whatever.
T.S. Eliot. Yeah.
But oh,
Yeah.
I think the debate that it's inspired, of course, is the one you and I had a brief exchange about. Is it's reanimated the trope. So my bias by using that particular the trope that computers are now on the cusp of taking away lots more jobs,
Right.
and so now we're at the precipice of the dystopia finally happening because the forecasters have been serially wrong. I don't know, for 2 centuries about automation taking away jobs. So now the ultimate automation, artificial intelligence, is so good and so easy to use that it's going to take away jobs
Hmm.
and create permanent high unemployment.
Well, this is really the crux of what I wanted to talk about today. It's not only AI, there's also robotics, which in my mind, I separate the two.
Well,
Robotics are machines that make cars and assemble the space station in orbit,
yeah, yeah.
and yeah,
Well, they're both robots. One is virtual. One works in the real world.
hardware
And
and software, right?
yeah, it's and they both require the same software. You need AI to make a physical robot work. But I
Right.
agree with you. I write about them as in the same way in my book. They're both robots. They're both a form of automation. One is knowledge automation, if you like, and the other is physical automation. But I agree with you. The functional impact of a anthropomorphic robot uh, joining you in space on the moon or on Mars or in a mine shaft is very different than a chat GPT writing the biography for Terry Virts.
Well, I'm interested from a from an entrepreneur's point of view, combining mechanical robotics with software AI. You could,
Me too.
then you end up with Terminator 2. But let's talk about the physical things. I read an article recently, Mark, that was interesting, and this is the genesis of this conversation. I mentioned it a few months ago to you, and the basic premise was different countries are threatened by automation,
Yeah.
robotics, to different amounts. And if you're a country that has a high percentage of manual manufacturing, you're more at risk. Another interesting thing, when the general belief is that American manufacturing has been destroyed. And if you look at manufacturing as a percentage of our GDP, so the percentage of our economy, it's been the same it's been pretty close to the same since the 70s. There's just a lot less people working in it, which means that
Yeah,
people are more productive.
exactly.
Um,
Which is the whole point of technology. But go
it's a
ahead.
good thing, right?
Yeah.
And so I can imagine in the 1800s there were people that there was some childhood legend about the guy that was fighting the train, trying to work harder than the train. And when trains came along or when cars came along, and we're going to lose horses and it's going to cost jobs. There's been a million different examples of technology threatening jobs, and here we are with the highest standard of living for all of humanity and the least amount of extreme poverty in human history. So
Yep.
things have gotten better through technology.
But this time it's different. This time it's different.
This time it's different. That's what they yeah, right. So is it or not?
Sure,
but they were saying that like 70% of Chinese jobs are going to be threatened by automation. And when you start threatening China, that really is potentially a globally destabilizing force. As much as I hate the Chinese Communist Party and really hate the things that they do, you do have to have some stability in such a massive country. And so anyway, so I'll just throw that over to you to talk about automation and robotics and threatening jobs.
Well, I mean, this is you're right. It's not a new idea. It's not a new feature of humanity. I mean, humans have always been trying to take the labor out of tasks, all tasks, for all of history. I mean, as I wrote in my book, the word computer refers to humans. It doesn't refer to machines.
Right.
A computer was a person who did computation, and we used to have rooms full of computers, people that did computations, not just accountants.
Right.
And there's a great book called the Computer Was a Person, I think is the title.
Well, Hidden Figures was about that. It was about
correct. It's exactly the last
people that had to do math. Yeah.
In the early era of NASA, not only did they have electronic computers, they also still had rooms full of computers, humans, because for certain kinds of math, people were still far faster than the computers of that day.
Right.
And so that's the point of the point is the word itself tells you a lot about the evolution of automation. The whole point was to eliminate those rooms full of human computers and replace them with a machine that would do the job better, faster. Right. And of course, it's beyond obvious that's what happened. So now when we're doing the same again, my point is that this is not a new phenomena. It applied to different things. Nor are robots fundamentally robots. By that, I mean what everybody really thinks in their head is a robot, not a machine, a pick and place machine bolted down next to a conveyor that grabs something and moves it, but rather, an anthropomorphic or quasi-anthropomorphic machine that's untethered, can walk around and do stuff beside humans or instead of humans, right? Pick up boxes, move things, which is what's happening in warehouses. But they're still robots. They're still automating a human task, either amplifying or replacing a person. There's absolutely nothing new about the idea, to your point. What's different is whether the idea can be manifested in a commercially useful way to be economically viable. So if you're a business, doesn't matter whether your business is military business of loading missiles under the wing of an aircraft or carrying materials out of a mine.
Right.
The business task of doing the physical labor, if I can get a machine to do that all in, which is not just the capital costs, but the operating and training and transition costs, is at least equal to or lower than the person, then, and typically it has to be lower than, because the integration costs in the real world are very high. You change a system around a new modality. That disruption, you don't do that disruption to match the economic cost, if you like, of a task. You do it because the disruption yields you a reduction in the cost to do the task. It has to be a significant,
like order of magnitude, right?
It does. Otherwise, you don't do it. It's just not worth it. This is true in our personal lives. You don't buy the thing that's 10% better. It requires disrupting your life. It has to be twice as good as not enough.
Right. You don't move into your neighbor's house in the same neighborhood.
No, it doesn't make no sense. And but let's just stipulate it's not new. But what is new, and is in both domains, ChatGPT, if you like, that we're automating knowledge tasks now that are more difficult than just simple computation. We're automating advice-giving tasks, which is what I categorize AI simplistically is advice-giving rather than computation, because it does estimates. The point of AI is not to get the exact right answer, the exact right biography of Mark Mills, something that's reasonably close enough to be let's call it 90+% accurate. And if I'm reading an X-ray film with an automated AI, I'd like it to be 99% accurate. The doctor might be 98. I want to, that 1 percentage point improvement is worth something in human health. So maybe I use it.
Right.
But AI doesn't have to be perfect. It's the whole point of it. It's not a computation.
Right. Well,
same is true of robots, right?
Yeah. Before we jump into AI, I want to talk about robots. So think about all the angst happening in America politics now. And a lot of it came from, fundamentally, it came from globalization and guys losing their jobs. It's hard. My grandfather didn't graduate from junior high, and he lived a middle class. He provided for a wife and 2 kids, middle class family his whole life as a union plumber, steam fitter. That is hard to do these days, in part because of automation, and in part because the jobs got shipped to China and Vietnam. So
I would tell you to interrupt.
Go ahead. Yeah. That's what I want to focus on right now. Yeah.
Most of the reason is the shifting of the jobs, not automation. Let's be clear about this. So most people don't know this fact. I didn't know this fact. So a recent survey published, 90% of American manufacturing companies don't have a single industrial robot in their facility. 90%, 90%. Which inversely, 90% of industrial robots are in the 10% of the firms, the big firms. And as you know, from an employment perspective, small manufacturing has more than half of all the employment. The small manufacturers support the big manufacturers in the typical penumbra of supply chains.
Right.
So the automation absolutely not, was not the primary reason of the loss of manufacturing jobs in America, or the outsourcing to other countries, which wasn't just a labor cost issue. It was a more complicated, but certainly the primary driver were the regulatory environment that create costs in America. We drove manufacturing and mining and the hard industries out of America by virtue of how our preferences politically and the regulatory state. So we've exported the jobs deliberately. Now let's set aside the forensics of the history. The state of the world is true that China, other countries, South American countries, Mexico, have a lot of the hard industries. By hard, I mean, not hard to do, but involve physical labor, lifting, welding. So then the real question is, let me just distill my view of where automation has taken us right now. The robots that are emerging, the class of automation, again, but the physical automation, the ability to make a robot that can perform a multitude of tasks, can be retrained and repurposed, is the holy grail of automation. 90% of their automation, 90% of the industrial robots that exist in the world up until now are dominantly in large firms, because the large firms are producing large quantities of very similar products at high volume.
Cars.
So when you do something like, in fact, the auto industry is the primary buyer for the last 30 years of industrial automation. The problem is that if you have a smaller firm, the tasks are more varied, involve being around people, and they have to be repurposed constantly. Robots have not been good enough to be able to be effectively retrained or be multi-purpose. Now they're becoming good enough for that. That's a big deal. What that means is that those robots can now, industrial automation can now move into the small and mid-sized firms. This is extraordinarily good for America. It is extraordinarily good for the skilled trades and skilled labor for 2 reasons. First of all, we still need them, and we need far more than that we have a supply. As you well know, the labor supply in skilled trades and the hard industries is in short supply. The average age of those in the skilled trades in the Western world is far higher. It's close to 50 now. It's far higher than in the population at large. So we have a future where there's going to be more demand for stuff that has to be fabricated, whether it's computers or pharmaceuticals or medical devices or cars or batteries. I don't care what it is that you want to make. We're going to have to make more of that with a smaller and older labor pool. The only way that's going to happen at all, much less at a lower cost, is if I can automate a larger number of tasks, which by definition means the majority of tasks which aren't the kind that we've automated so far, which is high volume mass production of very specific parts. So we're now on the cusp of making it possible to do something the politicians dream of, which is reshore. And this is what's important to your father's history and the history of people who live today, is I can increase the salary. I can pay a whole lot more, as you know, to somebody who is twice as productive, but who has skills. Because what I'm going to do with the robot, set aside the virtual robot, which has role here too, the chat bot, if you like, is I'm going to be able to pay them to upskill them. So I'll give you a simplistic example. So Boston Dynamics, as you know, is sort of I would call it, they're the best stunt robot maker in the world today, probably, right? As well as one of the best roboticists in the world. If you go, everybody goes to, who cares about robots? Seeing the Atlas backflipping robot, the anthropomorphic, quasi Terminator robot, it can run, backflip, it can roll, get up. But that's a stunt bot. And the rumor is it costs more than $1 million to make, but it would have been impossible to make that 10 years ago. Impossible. But the robot that they're selling, Spot Mini, which is the dog robot, is a commercial robot with a lot of the features that that Atlas has, the stunt robot. And Spot Mini is out doing tasks that are boring, which is safety surveillance tasks. And what that allows is the human being that used to do that, they get upskilled to do a higher value, higher paid task. And Boston Dynamics also did something else. They made their robot, I think it's called the Handle Bot, right? The Handle is the first robot that has crossed the Rubicon for unloading boxes from a truck. It can unload 800 boxes an hour. It's on wheels. It doesn't walk. It rolls around, has grippers that aren't hands. They're suction cups because it's unloading boxes. So it's a hyper-specialized, multi-purpose robot. The point is, it doesn't get bolted to an assembly line. It can unload any box. And it can work alongside humans because with modern sensors and AI, it knows you're there. It's not going to bang into you. You don't have to bolt it in the cage and keep people away from it. So you now have a robot that can unload the box. Why would that be a bad thing? It's a good thing, because the human that did it was doing a menial task that no robot could do. A human can now do a higher value task, get paid more, also do a task that doesn't involve physical labor, that has repetitive injuries that lead to healthcare costs and so forth. So you take that times 10, which we know is what's coming across the industrial landscape. And what you now have is a promise that we not only will have enough skilled trades, we'll be able to pay them a lot more. To your point, though, is that good or bad for China? Well, okay, the Chinese aren't dumb about this. They're actually moving faster and adopting this class of robotics for exactly the same reason we can and should. They have an aging workforce. Their aging workforce is aging far faster than ours. The demographics of China are terrible.
They're awful, thanks to their abortion.
Oh yeah, they're terrible. So so we have I would say I have the inverse view of this. Instead of seeing it dystopian, I see it as a way to minimize the kinds of stresses you're talking about, because the future of the world will not see a reduced demand for the physical stuff that the world needs, but we have a reduced capacity to supply it, because even in China, and especially in China, we don't have the workforce to do it. So the only way we're going to get to a future to have a lower cost, safer, and more environmentally benign way of producing all the hard goods is with more automation. And that automation hasn't existed until now.
Well, okay. So if you have a factory with 100 people and you automate it, after the automation, there's only 20 or 30 people working there. Now they're higher paid because they're higher skilled. And so the world is becoming really good for well-educated, highly trained people.
Well, you want to bifurcate the two words, trained and educated, because they have very specific differences in meaning. I mean, it broadly speaking, you're both education, but education usually means college and people.
Yeah, that's a good point.
So I actually take the opposite view. The world is becoming much friendlier for those who are not, quote, highly educated, who have skills that are hard to automate, that are easier to amplify with emerging robotics. So we actually have a reverse of what happened in the first industrial revolution. In the first industrial revolution, because we had a surplus of people with, quote, skills, a lot of them lost work, but ultimately they found jobs. Otherwise, the world wouldn't have had. We have the opposite of an unemployment problem. We have a shortage of labor problem because of automation. It's inverse of. So
that's an interesting point.
If automation would cause permanent unemployment, Terry, think about this. We've been automating the industrial sector for 2 centuries.
Right.
Why do we have a shortage of labor in the country? Where did the job? Let me be clear. If you have a company, to your point, you have 100 employees, and you decide that tomorrow I'm going to buy 20 robots that replace 80 employees, and I keep 20 employees who now produce more than the previous 100, but I only have 20 of them. I'm only going to do that if the net cost is cheaper than keeping those employees. And that is still not true for most tasks, but it's becoming more and more true. Mm-hmm. But the most important point is that doesn't happen overnight. We're now on the cusp of that becoming the trend. And the velocity of that trend, as those robots become cheaper and better, more reliable, the velocity of that trend, you hope, is faster than the velocity of the aging of the skilled workforce. Because if you're the employer of those 100 people, they're old. It's a silver tsunami. A lot of them are going to retire on you. You are begging, you are hoping that you could buy a damn robot to replace the person who's going to retire on you in 5 years or 10 years. And I think the good news is that where we are with physical automation, real robots, the Terminator class robots, if you like, is that we are now on a cusp of a growth in their capacities, and the reduction in their costs such that it roughly matches the retiring of the workforce at a time when the demand for their products is going up, not down. Now, if those curves are never perfectly aligned. So if the supply of robots grows more slowly than the demand for them, the robots will be pretty pricey. And so they'll go more slowly. If the inverse happens, there'll be a little higher unemployment, right? If the robots get cheaper faster than this tsunami, then you're the employer. Maybe you fire the guy before he retires. Okay. So now he's collecting unemployment. We have safety nets that we didn't have in the Industrial Revolution. I guess if I were hoping for an outcome, because you're never going to get a perfect match, I could sort of hope for the latter, because the latter would mean that the stresses you're talking about are alleviated, that there's actually, because we don't have an unemployment problem, we have an underemployment problem.
Right.
You should be hoping and praying that these things get good enough and cheap enough, fast enough that we can stay ahead of the curve, that it's disinflationary rather than inflationary. Because right now the reason we have inflation is not just Federal Reserve policies and not just the Congress printing too much money. And inflation, by definition, is too much money chasing too few goods.
Right. Okay? Supply and demand.
I know an easy fix: make more goods.
Right.
I don't have to jigger the interest rates. I don't have to have a Federal Reserve. If I have an oversupply of goods, it's deflationary.
Right.
How do you get more goods with fewer people? Automation.
Productivity. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's a great point for inflation. All this demagoguery makes my head explode about the price of gas. Well, Biden
produce more gas.
Well, yeah, right. Well, yeah, which Saudi Arabia should be doing. But anyway,
they're trying to match the two curves perfectly because they got nothing else to sell.
Yeah,
we got a lot of stuff to sell. We got a lot of options. We can sell oil and gas. And we do, right? We're one of the world's 3 biggest producers.
Right.
But it's a share of our economy. It's significant. It's in the 10% range. For Saudi Arabia, it's in the 90% range.
Right.
So they care an awful lot about the curves matching. We care, but it's not existential for us, for our country.
Right. America is it's such a great country for so many reasons. But
amen to that.
Our freedom, our opportunity which is why I hate it when I hear people bad mouthing the country. Although in some ways it's good because you can do that. Like I kind of don't mind when people protest, because that's why I was in the military for 30 years. You can feel free to protest, but
the key to your point is that you have to be free to protest.
Yeah.
And the whole debate over cancel culture of deplatforming people. Right. Is that the two ends of the spectrum are protest when it takes the form of physical violence, is
Right.
we all know is unacceptable.
Right.
There's very few cases where that's acceptable in history, and there are times it's rare. At the other end of the spectrum, uh, suppressing somebody's ability to say something you don't like that you think is inappropriate, or you deem fake, or you deem the government deems disinformation. I'd rather let the market sort out what's fake news and disinformation than bureaucrats,
Right.
and whoever happens to be in power, because power changes hands. This is the risk. So I'm on the same page. I think it's
Yeah.
great that we live in a country that's still, despite the debate we're having over our capacities and abilities to protest and talk, it's still far better than anywhere else in the world, near as I can tell.
Yeah. It's a pretty great, it's a pretty great country. But when you mentioned cancel culture, so much of there's the Twitter files, and
Yeah,
they're not allowing you to talk about Hunter Biden's laptop, whatever. But the reality is the biggest censorship is self-censorship,
yeah.
because in today's world, I mean, I'm not that popular. You're more popular than I am, but
It's
there's certain
probably
things,
probably the
we
inverse.
can't say.
Hey, you're Terry Virts. You're far more popular than me. Come on.
Well, but you know what I mean? Like if you're a sports cat, if you work at
Yeah,
ESPN
yeah, yeah.
or wherever, there's just some things you cannot even touch,
Yeah, but you're right. And so you constrain yourselves, and a certain amount of this. I don't. Again, I would say, as an amateur student of history, is not new,
Yeah.
and we go through cycles of hypertrophied um, creations of ideas, words, themes that are considered politically déclassé, embarrassing, banned, and it's been true throughout history. And people have been canceled slash deplatformed, eliminated, and fired many times in history for political positions, social positions. I mean, it happens, and it's not the first time. We probably were in an interregnum the last 2 decades prior to the current, spate of cancel culture, where there's less of that going on. It seemed like before that there was a lot of it going on. Uh, but I agree with you. I think that's the problem. I mean, if you're a prominent person, you have to sort of think hard about what you're going to say. Partly because you don't want to offend people, partly because you don't want to lose your job, partly because it'll. But I would just say, at the high level of abstraction, often people who get into trouble are saying things that they know better they shouldn't say. It's provocative, and the fact that some things in the popular culture are considered radioactive, it's like, or to use the comic book term, is kryptonite, right? You
Right.
can't say or touch that subject.
Right.
Okay. If you're trying to make a point about your domain of expertise, we're talking about robots, technology, and energy. There are aspects of this which are really sensitive to people. I mean, I get it in a cultural and social sense. All right. Just be careful how you talk around them, because my goal would be is to think about what that other person, what's in their head, why they're objecting to a certain way of thinking or talking, and maybe I can express an idea or an opinion in a way that's sort of a back door, if you like, or it's on the edge of the penumbra of what their anxieties are about, to get them to think differently about that particular objection they have or anxiety. It's not perfect. I mean, in the energy world, if you say that you can't eliminate oil and gas or coal, you're claimed to be a climate denier. I mean, that's sort of the invective that comes back.
Right. Right. Right.
So I'm not allowed to express the opinion about a fact. We aren't eliminating oil, gas, and coal. It's not happening.
Right.
Doesn't make it, to get labeled a climate denier as an invective because you
Right.
say that, is the statement of that is a statement of fact. We haven't done it.
Right.
It's the
But
data
but
tell
then
you
you
it's
can't
probably
get a
not.
job if you
Well,
want to go
yeah,
teach at a university.
but yes.
You can't
So
get a job. That's real.
that's
Right.
and that's when things go too far, right? Then in
Right.
the academic sphere, it's supposed to be where you have a debate going on. Okay, they should clean up their act. It's obviously not true education. It's not
Right.
intellectual freedom. If it's in the corporate environment, if you can't get a job at Google or Amazon because you expressed a public opinion that you don't think that we can eliminate oil, the electric vehicles aren't going to solve all the world's problems. If you couldn't get a job, say, at Google because you said something like that publicly, that's really offensive and stupid,
Yeah.
especially if the person that you wanted to hire was a really good coder.
Right.
Uh, and hire the good coder anyway.
Right.
You could say to them, as a matter of favor, do me a favor, just keep it down. I mean, you can imagine
Right.
a boss saying to you, do me a
Right.
favor. It's not your wheelhouse. It gets people excited.
Right.
And if the person didn't cooperate, they did it anyway. Okay, I guess if you fired them, first it'd be stupid if they're really competent. They go work
Right.
for the competition, especially given what we just saw the courts ruling that non-compete clauses may be, because the FTC rather, if the
Yeah.
FTC decides non-compete clauses are illegal in general, then it's going to become even more problematic to fire competent employees.
Isn't that an interesting thing? So that the FTC has this non-complete thing, which I kind of like because I've been asked to sign
Yeah.
some pretty egregious non-competes, which I don't like, but it's really capitalist. It's promoting,
Yeah.
capitalism, but it's the Democrats that are pushing this, which is interesting, and it's the Republicans who the highest level guys who are bound by non-completes are probably Republicans. So it's a really interesting dynamic of who's helping who.
Yeah, I think it's a complicated area,
Yeah,
but it's intellectually simple. You can imagine I always thought non-compete clauses, 99% of them are unenforceable. So I say this not as a lawyer, but looking at this practical matter. If I sign a non-compete, I mean, how are you going to come on? For the 99% of things you're going to do and no, that's not enforceable. For things that are obviously secrets of the company you worked for, most secrets are obvious that they're secret and that they are truly proprietary. An awful lot of that stuff is
patents or IP.
yeah. I mean, it's
Yeah.
so if you steal that stuff, it's theft because
Mm-hmm.
it's protected. Patent or specific IP is protected by law.
Right.
The idea of stealing the expertise you gain in a company when you go work for another company, you can see the problem with that is the whole point of the trade between me and you as an employee employer is that you want me to develop expertise. It becomes my expertise. It's mine. Now you've paid me to develop it, but I've given you my time in exchange, and I've spent my energy and my intellectual power or whatever, my physical skills to learn something for you. I've given you something. I've made you more productive. You've made more money. There's an exchange, right? It's the symmetry there is sort of obvious intuitively to people, which is why it ticks them off. Like I've given you something too. You haven't given me something.
It's right. So in my heart, I'm rooting for that. Like I like the idea of not having to sign non-competes, but I don't know. Well, it's an interesting.
I just it's a full employment act for lawyers. Think about it. They're going to figure out a new way to write a contract, an employment contract that will more specifically, narrowly define what we consider as secret, not a non-compete, what you can't steal from me.
Mm-hmm.
And so what this will mean is that your employment contract, instead of being 5 pages, will be 50. You won't understand a word it says anyway.
Right. And then you'll have to hire your own lawyer to
and the lawyers will win anyway.
And then those guys, they're going to go play golf together. Yeah.
I guarantee you it's going to be the full employment act for employment lawyers.
Well, so I was reading the works of, you sent me the reading list before to prepare for this. And you had a really interesting point, and I want to see if you can define it. Okay. So my question for you is, will energy follow the trajectory of computing?
Yeah, no.
Okay. Next question. But that's an interesting thing. So there's no Moore's law for energy, or what were you talking about there?
Well, you and I both know, because we both are exposed to a lot of pitches that people are making, and we read a lot in this domain. The most common analogy made in all kinds of forms is that energy tech is following this trajectory of disruptive innovation, and it's analogized to computing and communications tech. And it's not just an occasional reference or analogy. All kinds of reports, International Monetary Fund, DOE, venture capitalists, everybody uses different examples about the transition and the velocity of the transition from the kind of clunky computers we had in the 80s to what we are to now, from clunky punch cards to chat GPT, from dial phones to smartphones. And so this velocity of it disrupted markets and economies in ways that we all know lots about. So that analogy is used all the time, and it's used constantly, that energy tech. So they invoke the word tech. Of course, everything's technical. Technology is a sloppy term. covers a lot of things. But by energy tech, it's invoking computing and communications tech, because that's what tech has come to mean in the popular lexicon. And we're invoking that velocity to change. So batteries are going to get cheaper. Electric cars will follow the tech trajectory of computers. Windmills and solar power are going to follow the tech trajectory, get cheaper and cheaper. And we're now on the cusp of an exponential change, is the word you all the time, because in information technology, we had exponential change. So that's used so much and so often. It's so offensive and so wrong and so silly. It's a category error. So the progress that you can get in information, in storing moving bits, is physically impossible to see happen in the physical energy domains, because what you're doing in the information space, simplistically, is I'm trying to find, being very simplistic, easier, faster ways to represent a 0 and a 1, in effect. That's what it all distills to: a transistor that is a one of two states, on or off, 0 or 1.
Well, and there's abundant sand.
Right.
Like silicon is not.
Well, silicon is
limited.
Is abundant, but the problem is not that silicon's limited. Sand is that what I can do with the silicon is I can perform a magic trick.
Mm-hmm.
I can transmit data by stripping out white space. I can compress it. Everybody knows what a compression algorithm. A compression algorithm looks at repetitive stuff in a file, whether it's audio or video. It strips out the stuff that's no information in it, and it does other clever tricks. Says, well, the next thing looks like the previous thing, so I don't have to have the previous thing transmitted. I just have to have it transmitted something that takes less information, which is, it looks like. All right, we can't do that with a person. In Star Trek, I can disassemble a human being and put them back together. I can't compress a person. The energy it takes to move you and me in an airplane from A to B is the amount of energy is dictated by the physics of gravity, of friction, of weight and mass, and you can do nothing to change that. So energy systems like photovoltaic cells or batteries. So I use an example when I talk about this. So if there were a Moore's law for batteries, because that's where it gets applied to, like, oh, energy tech is coming to electric cars, and they're gonna get cheaper every day. All right, here's two things you need to know. The battery in the electric car, the cost to make it, about 75% of the cost to make it now is in the cost of buying the materials. 75% of the cost of lithium batteries, just in not the manufacturing, not the labor, not the technology, the cost of the bill of materials, the lithium, the cobalt, the aluminum, the nickel. It's the materials. So if the materials double in price, let's just be simplistic, the batteries cost will go up about, well, you can do 75% of 200%, go up, it won't double. It'll go up only 150%. Well, the supply of metals now determines the cost of the battery, not how clever the tech is. It's a mining industry. And there's nothing I can do with waving PowerPoint presentations about exponential change to change the quantity of copper that I need.
The raw materials, So in computing, you don't have that problem. That was my joke about sand, but
exactly. Well, the sand part is
silicon is not as limited as cobalt and nickel.
Well, no, but sand is limited, but it's more sand than cobalt. But both are not limited. The point is, I can take a pound of cobalt or copper and make a certain amount of a conductor. I can reduce the amount of the conductor I need by doing clever things, but I can't reduce it 10-fold or 100-fold. I can reduce the amount of silicon I need to perform a computation by 1 billion-fold, which is what's happened. The amount of silicon, the amount of physical sand and silicon I need to do a computation today compared to 1980s is 1 billion times lower. Billion. Now, if I could do the same with battery, in 10 years, I'd have a battery the size of the your smartphone that could fly an A380. It would fly an A380 to China.
So both the supply, raw materials, and also the physics and chemistry, both of those are in the favor of computing, and they're not in the favor of batteries and solar panels. And
they're just not. They're just different. These are different domains of physics, and invoking this is embarrassing, silly. It's a category error. Now, the truth is, the computational space is helping the mining industry, because as we bring automation, we're talking about, we're short miners. where we need the biggest application for automated trucks now, trucks without drivers, is not on the highways delivering goods for Amazon. It's on the mine sites of the world. Caterpillar has been operating and has delivered billions of ton miles of materials on trucks with no drivers now for years. There are trucks driving around mine sites without humans because there's a shortage of humans and the trucks are good enough for that task.
And it's a limited task and you know exactly where you're going and you don't have all the things
Correct.
that cars
Right.
can't handle. Yeah.
Right.
I like that a lot.
But
Yeah.
it's not an easy task. I mean, it was
Yeah.
good on Caterpillar. It's not,
Yeah.
so Elon Musk is trying to automate your car.
Yeah.
Caterpillar is trying to automate the truck. Both are really, really hard to do, but automating the car is more than an order of magnitude more difficult
Yeah.
because of the domain it's in. A truck drives at 10 miles an hour. It's on a track that's pretty limited.
Right.
The people that are around it, first of all, it's a workforce I
Are
can train on.
trained. Right.
And I have safety
Right.
procedures, blah, blah, blah. Also, the cost metrics. If I make the truck that's $1 million truck have to have on board $400,000 of automation, but I eliminate a driver that I'm paying $300,000 a year to with overhead, who I need three of those drivers. You can get the math. All of a sudden, the $1 million truck becomes a
After
good
2 years,
platform.
it's paid itself off, and
Exactly.
after that, it's all
But the
gravy.
same $300,000 of software, sensors, and compute
Right.
is needed for the $30,000 car.
Yeah.
Exactly the same.
Mark, my view in life about almost everything is usually moderation, politics, and science. Like
moderation in all things, including moderation.
Exactly. Now I don't want too much of it, but like cars, I think my next car, I'd like it to be a plug-in hybrid because I like the idea of not paying for gas if I'm just driving around town. But if I want to drive to Florida, I want to be able to drive to Florida, and I don't want to. I don't mind buying a little bit of batteries from China, but I don't want to buy this huge thing. You know what I mean? Like the plug-in hybrid seems like a way to go, and having technology that makes your driving safer seems like the way to go. But completely automating it seems very dangerous and unlikely and not going to happen. So,
of course, you and I are on the same page on this, and so was the president of Toyota, who, as you know, I'll say indiscreetly, come out of the closet, so to speak, in the last month to talk about these issues. And he's the only auto executive. I think Stellantis auto executive, a CEO, is doing the same. And look, what he said is obviously true. You could make 10 plug-in hybrids for every single pure electric car because you need a much smaller battery, roughly a tenth the size.
Exactly.
So that would allow me to pay twice as much for the battery. Let's just go down this and make all the materials in America or Canada, where the mining is more expensive because we do it without slave labor. And the refining will be more expensive because we have more strict environmental rules, but I can still afford the battery. So I can reshore that.
Right.
But to your point, behaviorally and operationally, and I think I sent you the piece I wrote about EVs at year end last year. The functional utility of a pure electric vehicle for most people, for most applications, is low. I mean, we'll pick a number, say 20% of the total market of cars globally would be the second vehicle, which I never want to take on a long trip, which is basically for local driving. You just never drive more than 30 to 40 miles in a day in it. You're never making a long trip in it. In America, there's more cars than there are drivers. Most homes have two vehicles. We're now at a majority of homes with two or more vehicles. So the second vehicle is a pure electric. Okay, it has a functionality. You never have to go near a gas station. It's plugged in at night. You don't care if it takes 8 hours to charge because you're not in a hurry. But any driving you do at distance, you now run into a double problem. You need a much bigger battery, which is heavy, more expensive, offshoring materials. And you need a charging infrastructure that's really different because charging overnight is not acceptable. And in the physics of the world we live in, moving electrons at the same velocity as we move gasoline is really, really hard in power terms. So, when you refuel an airplane, you've seen this, we refuel airplanes and aircraft carriers the way we refuel Formula One cars. We have giant pipes that move, hundreds of gallons per second, like boom, you're in there, you're out of there. Okay, with electricity, you have to do this at the not at the 220 volt level, the 440 volt level. You do this at the megawatt level,
right,
with copper bus bars that are literally the diameter of
right.
a pipe, that weigh hundreds of pounds, that involve electrical control systems that are you think gasoline is dangerous. You start
Yeah,
working in megawatts of DC power, and
it's a lot
you're
of
in
energy.
you're in real dangerous territory in
Yeah,
terms of operational
yeah,
behaviors and safety. And it's crazy expensive. It's
yeah.
crazy expensive. I mean, like, so you're right. I would make a prediction, and I would take the bet. If we wanted to bet what the future will look like, what will dominate the roadways of America, plug-in hybrids, because
But
they just make a lot of sense.
the CEO of General Motors, I forgot her name. She
Mary
said they're going
O'Bear.
all electric.
Yeah, well,
California said
yeah,
they're
yeah.
not going to
I know.
allow. I
I
mean,
know.
those are
Yeah,
really bad decisions.
they are.
California also said they won't allow
Yeah,
state employees to travel to Georgia because they had a law about girls playing girls sports and boys playing boys.
yeah.
Anyway, but
Those, that's a whole separate stupid decision.
that's another podcast. Yeah.
I don't want to talk about that stuff. Look, the one thing, there's two separate issues here that are related because of the politics of cars and the regulation of automobiles.
Yeah.
And they relate. When governments start telling you have to do something, we move into statist territories where corporations, especially big ones, kind of obey. That's what happens. It's good. It's not so good in my opinion, but you don't want to go too far down that route, because you end up in the sort of fascist territories of societies where governments are telling industries how to operate.
Mm-hmm.
But they don't have to order them around. They can do things like ban stuff,
or taxes, or yeah.
taxes and regulations. So I mean, I've made this prediction before. I'll make it again. All the rules, laws, whatever the legislation to ban the purchase of internal combustion engines will end. They'll get novated, they'll disappear, they won't last, for a very simple reason. And the timeframes that are being imagined, it's literally impossible. It's just not imaginable. There will be enough affordable electric vehicles to fill that gap. Affordable, right. Key word here. Because the average purchase price for a car in America is one half the average sale price of an EV. And EVs aren't getting cheaper, they're getting more expensive now, right, because of materials problems.
So, and you're competing with batteries for the grid, right? The wind and solar.
If we do that, we make it even worse. But that's the least of it. You're competing with the whole world.
Well, that's what we're doing.
Oh,
I mean, there's exactly the batteries for the grid are being made. I mean,
sure they are, and they're equally goofy because economics there make no sense.
Yeah.
But what will happen is you'll make if the law stays in place, you know what happens is people extend the life of their used car. So the cost of used cars goes up, the maintenance costs goes up.
Inefficient gas guzzling used cars.
Oh, exactly. And
we'll
the older the car
using
is,
those.
you use them longer. You'll create a black market in cars to relabel them as used. So if you can't buy a new car in a specific state that's internal combustion, well, maybe I buy the car in the adjacent state, turn it into a used car, and then bring it into my state as a quote used car. I mean, there'll be workarounds.
It's insane.
It's nuts. And look, it's not only that it won't happen, because it just won't happen. It doesn't matter what the politicians say. It's not going to happen. We're not going to have all cars being purchased as electric vehicles, because you could do this in Norway.
Right.
If you're the first out, because Norway has about the same population as Manhattan.
Yeah.
5 million people.
It's Houston. It's the city I live in, is Norway.
Yeah. So you have Norwegians are wealthy. They're one of the wealthiest nations on earth.
Yeah.
It's quasi-homogenous. They don't drive long distances because where they live, it's not only a tiny country, where they live is even tinier.
Yeah.
They have 90% hydropower, which is a very, very reliable baseload, quote, renewable energy.
Right.
And this is the key. I just looked this up yesterday because I'm giving a lecture there next week. And the revenue per capita from selling oil and gas to the world is $25,000. $25,000 per capita gross revenues to the Norwegian people per person in Norway from selling. And as you know, they get a royalty distribution. The government sends Norwegian citizens a check each year, or maybe it's quarterly, I don't know, from the profits from selling oil and gas to the rest of the world. So they, good on them. They can
right.
virtue signal. And incidentally, Tesla is still the number one
Yeah.
selling vehicle in Norway. So the whole EV story is in fact an Elon Musk story so far. It really is.
You can't swing a dead cat without hitting a Tesla there. But if you're just driving in Oslo, that's fine. But if you want to go to Bergen or Tromsø or Trondheim, like that's 1,000-mile drive, and there's not a lot of. They still have issues there, and so
they have more superchargers per capita than are
yeah,
here. But what they're also discovering is the actual cost to refuel a vehicle with a supercharger,
right.
both the cost of electricity at peak, because you're charging at peak,
Mm-hmm.
and the cost of the supercharger results in a real economic cost that's higher than the cost of expensive gasoline in Europe.
Yeah,
The real cost to refuel is higher.
is higher than gas. Wow.
Yeah.
Well, it's an interesting thing. So, fusion. We just had this fusion thing. I've been when I was in high school. I remember
Not
first of all, I
cold
remember
fusion, but real fusion.
yeah, nuclear fusion.
Yeah.
I remember reading a book about how we were going to run out of oil and gas by the 70s,
Yeah.
and I was writing that term paper in the 80s, so the book was a little bit dated. But there's been, and I remember reading about the tokamak in the 1970s, this giant magnet that compresses the nuclear fuel to make it stick together and
Giant superconducting magnet.
yeah.
Yeah.
And I love fusion, and by Back to the Future, they had a Mr. Fusion on the DeLorean, and in the year 2500, we're not going to be driving dinosaur fueled gas cars. In the year 2400, we probably won't. 2300, in the year 2100, there probably will still be oil and gas around. So it's going to take some time. But what do you think about this? The National Ignition Facility out at Livermore. What do you think of that?
Well, we could bifurcate it to two observations which are indisputably true. It's a remarkable accomplishment in the physics of fusion. It really is. It really is a milestone, and the physicists justifiably, and being a physicist myself, who love fusion from day one, we should love fusion. By the way, as an aside, but for fusion, no sun. And but for fusion, none of the elements that we build everything out of, from cobalt to neodymium,
we wouldn't exist.
They don't exist.
We're fusion of hydrogen, ultimately.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The fusion process is what's produced all the elements that exist in the universe, and then they get spewed around by supernova. So, and it's a wonderful thing. Fusion is. It's in fact, you could be theological and metaphysical. It is in fact the very source, to your point, of our existence. But for fusion, nothing.
It's how God created everything. You could say that.
And all he had to do is create fusion, and everything else followed.
Yep, exactly.
Look, the physics goal of having a pellet impacted by laser energy. So this is a pellet of not hydrogen, but tritium, a form of hydrogen. This tiny sort of pellet, call it eraser-sized pellet, to have the amount of energy from those laser photons stimulate a fusion, collapse it, just crash it in with the pure power of these photons, as opposed to the magnetic field. Yield more energy than put into it. That sort of break even, it yielded, I think, 20% more than in, is a milestone. It
for
really
a microsecond.
Yeah, it's a milestone.
Yeah.
And getting to a microsecond of it is a big deal.
Yeah.
But I guess what I would say is it probably means that the joke that fusion is 50 years away for the last 50 years is that maybe it's actually 50 years away now from knowing how to make a fusion reactor. Maybe we're actually now within 50 years of making a power plant that would reach true break even. And by that, the energy used to make the laser photons was 200 times more than the energy put in that yielded 120% more energy. Or put differently, it's still 200-fold away from true break even, which is a long way away. And to get to true break even, you'd have to have lasers that were 200 times more efficient than the lasers that exist, or that we know how to build.
Yeah.
So that fusion milestone tells you that we're one step along a very, very long journey towards figuring out how to make a net energy producing machine as opposed to a net energy consuming machine. But we are so far away. I guess I was trying to think of an analogy. The analogy that would probably be sort of technologically accurate. The development of the idea of internal combustion itself, the steam engine, was a milestone. Like this is, everybody knows that, right? The steam engine, Watt, predated by Newcomen. But the Watt engine was a milestone. There were steam engines before Watt.
Mm-hmm.
It was called the Newcomen engine, but the Watt engine was a milestone.
Mm-hmm.
The distance technologically from the Watt engine to the aircraft you flew with combustion is the distance we are today to useful fusion.
To useful fusion.
We just had the equivalent of a James, and even that's, by the way, hyperbolic, because Watt's engine produced more energy than went into it. Mm-hmm. It was actually a useful machine. They used them all over the world.
Right.
This machine is not even useful yet.
Right.
So, but because we're faster, we've accelerated the exponential rate of change. Blah blah blah.
Right.
I'll give this machine the equivalent of being the first steam engine. But what we want to build is I don't know, an
747
or 747.
Yeah.
747 is a better example because we want commercial, not military stuff.
Mm-hmm.
It's a long journey. The lasers that did this can fire once or twice a day. To do a power plant, you'd have to fire 10 times a second.
Right.
So we didn't even know how to do that. So my point is the lasers would have to become not 200 times more efficient. They have to become 1,000 times more efficient, which actually is not possible with the laser physics that we know, because you can't have break even. The lasers have to, the whole process of energy in and energy out can't be 20% better. It's not an energy producing machine. That's okay, but every energy producing machine we have, from wind turbines to gas turbines, on a pure energetics basis over their operation, they're not 20% better than energy in. They're 2,000% better than of energy out over energy in, or they're worthless. They're not worth anything.
So there are companies out there
they sure are
claiming this decade what you're
they get venture funding, good on. Look,
right.
I'll stipulate something that is obvious in the physics, to your point of how long we use liquid fuels, like oil in particular, hydrocarbons. They will stop using natural hydrocarbons when we can synthesize a hydrocarbon replacement that's equivalent to all the features of oil. And by that, the equivalent, I mean cost, storability, flammability, all those things. When we can make a synthetic that costs the same or less, that has all the features, we'll stop to your point, drilling for dinosaur oil. But it's not dinosaur oil, but that's all separate.
Ferns, I know, but it's better to. In the F-16, we used to say, how was your day out? Good. Turning dinosaurs into noise. So,
well, as you know, that it rains natural gas on the moons of Saturn and Jupiter.
Titan.
And there's oceans of natural gas there. And so if dinosaurs melt down to make natural gas, that means they had space travel and they all went there to die. So obviously, liquid hydrocarbons, do get created without biological compression over the millennia. But look, physicists, to your question about the startup ventures. So some bright physicists, some bright chemists, some brilliant person, male, female, immigrant, illegal immigrant, doesn't make any difference, right? Some really bright person will have a breakthrough in the physics of fusion, the physics of superconductivity, the physical chemistry of catalysis. I mean, all kinds of things that relate to how we make machines and that tap into the fundamental energetics of the universe. The universe is awash in energy. So we've always been trying to figure out how to trick nature to let us access it in ways that are useful to us. Someone will come up with an insight that was fundamental and phenomenologically different. It will happen. And it could be one of those ventures. It could be. So I don't know enough about each of them to say anything useful, except that let's stipulate it could happen. And if it does happen, then I do know enough about the trajectory of making industrial machines to say that if the epiphany happened tomorrow, somebody got a breakthrough, the timeline from that to useful industrial machines scaling, because everything is difficult to scale at the scales of society.
Right.
Loosely speaking, if you look over modern history and longer history, but the numbers haven't changed much. It's 30 to 50 years out before you begin to scale. I mean, the lithium chemistry was invented in the mid-70s by Exxon chemist. It wasn't commercially viable via Sony until early 90s, so
Wow.
almost 20 years. And it didn't become useful at scale to make a Tesla for almost another 20 years when Elon Musk, announced the Tesla S. And now that's 15 years ago. And now we have 1% of world's cars with lithium batteries. So we're now 50 years after the epiphany. 50 years after the epiphany.
Right.
If there's an epiphany tomorrow in fusion, equivalent to, it was the lithium chemistry epiphany was a straight line, quote unquote, but a difficult to the batteries of today.
Right.
There's no straight line for fusion yet, but when it happens, it'll be another 50 years. So that's why this joke is actually not just a joke. The line is 50 years away is true. And we haven't had a fusion moment yet equivalent to the epiphany over lithium chemistry for batteries. We haven't had that moment yet. The ignition facilities moment wasn't that moment because it wasn't break even.
Right. True break even.
Yeah.
Well, they've been saying the same thing about, we've been 20 years from Mars since 1969. Werner von Braun said we'll be at Mars in 20 years.
Yeah.
And then in 89, George H.W. Bush had a program to get to Mars, and it was going to take 20 years. And so there's one final thing I want to end on. You said,
but we will get to Mars in 20 years this time.
Right, exactly. Guaranteed. I'll bet you $1.
What you and I talked about this before is that the key to the Mars mission is getting there quickly, which is nuclear propulsion. If we get serious about going to Mars, we'll build nuclear propulsion so we can get there in weeks, not months and years.
Exactly.
Because you just can't build, you can't expose people to that. The risks are too high. The probabilities of bad outcomes are just grotesque. That's just
3 years of food, 3 years of spare parts at $1
3
million
years of risk,
a pounds.
3 years of the chance of a massive solar storm frying everybody on board.
Nuclear power is required. Exactly. I'm going to do a talk on this next month, and that's my thesis. But you had a quote that I love, and it comes back to climate change and fusion. Like fusion's kind of the hope for long-term energy, right?
Yeah.
In the year 2100 or 2200, at some point, hopefully we'll have nuclear fusion plants that don't, whatever. But your quote was, you were talking about carbon tax, was a stroke of the pen can inflate costs, but it can't change reality. Richard Feynman in the Challenger accident investigation said, nature cannot be fooled. This idea is ignored by humans all the time, but it's true.
Yeah.
And fusion would hopefully reduce climate emissions, but in today's, all these different things we're talking about, and I think you brought this up on our last podcast, the additional emissions that India and China are doing vastly by orders of magnitude outweigh the minor incremental improvements that we're making.
Yeah.
We're cutting back by a few percent and they're adding 100%. Those aren't the right numbers, but something like that.
It's ratios like that. They're 20 to 1 ratios, 50 to 1 ratios.
Right.
For every one we cut, they are adding 20 to 50. Yeah.
But what do we do with that? I mean, I'm not just going to throw up my hands and say, just pollute away, burn, baby, burn, because I mean, I don't know, we're kind of leaving a mess for our children and grandchildren. Our great grandchildren won't care because we're not making any more dinosaurs, and eventually the missions will end. But
you're back to your dinosaurs theory.
it feels inevitable though, Mark. Like it just feels like we're not going to cut back on emissions because we can't tell China and India what to do, and they want their people to come out of extreme poverty, which is understandable.
Yeah, exactly.
So it feels like we just have to deal with it. Is that not what should happen? Is that what's going to happen?
Well, so I like where you begin. So I'm much more optimistic than you and about the outcome, but it's based on something that you and I both agree on. But it begins with the premise, of course, that reality. I mean, the quote, Feynman's quote was I was sort of intellectually borrowing from Feynman. Philip K. Dick had a great line, which I discovered recently, which was that reality is that which still exists when you stop believing in it.
That is a great.
Yeah. So go the
That
same
is a
line.
great
I mean,
quote.
I say physics wins in the end, but in the end we can ignore it. I mean, look, the fact is the world's emissions are going up. It's the fact, despite all the money. And the fact is the world's emissions are going to keep going up. It's just a fact because that's what the behavioral thing is. Set aside aspirations. So that's just, to your point, a fact. So then the question which you're asking is, what do we do? And my answer is not facetious. It falls into the two camps, and they're the obvious ones if we're dealing with reality. The first reality is if you want different phenomenologies to provide energy for society, we do need new physics. And like we've been talking about, I don't think new physics aren't possible. It's just that they require much more patience than people have, policymakers and people have. So the change to different energy modalities will take far, far longer than people imagine. And because of that reality, it's not an opinion in a sense. People think it's an opinion. That's just locked into the long history of human nature, engineered systems, the size of our society. So requires patience, which we don't have. And if one believes, whatever one believes about the consequences of what we do today, which is burning lots of hydrocarbons, whatever one believes about it, whatever actually happens in the future, right? The thing we have to deal with is resilience and response. That's just a fact. So if you deal in reality, the reality is we're going to burn hydrocarbons for a long time, absent the end of the human race. That's just the fact. Behavioral changes aren't going to happen. The people have waved their hands and people should behave differently. That's like asking the sun not to rise.
Right.
It's not going to happen. It's silly. It's infantile.
Right.
So China's going to burn more. India's going to burn more. It's going to happen. And that's not just because they're stupid. It's not because they don't understand. It's because they don't have options in the real world, nor do we. So what do you do? Well, that's where the whole resilience debate comes in. So you have to start spending money and be honest about both resilience in the broadest sense in the world and responsiveness to nature's assaults on humans. Whether you think the assaults are going to get worse because of climate change or they're going to happen anyway because climates always change is irrelevant. That debate is entirely irrelevant to the fact that there's a net good to spending more money on resilience to nature, resilience to droughts, resilience to too much rain, resilience to too little, resilience to fires, resilience, whatever the resilience feature is,
right,
costs money and takes engineering. But one thing that's nice about that is we know how to do that. Those are in domains where the engineering and the physics, the biochemistry, the biophysics are all feasible to make material and significant differences. And the climate, what I call the apocalyptics, who, damn the torpedoes, we're just going to plow ahead with strategies that don't work. They don't want to do that because they say that you're capitulating to not solving the problem. You're giving up to Exxon. You're their way. This is again infantile dialogue.
Right.
It's not Exxon. Exxon doesn't run India or China.
Right.
It's the reality of the world we live in.
Right.
Do I think we can get more resilience to nature's assaults? You bet. But I mean, this is where automation, AI, new material science, the kinds of things we have the capacity to do to improve capacity to withstand assaults from nature are really quite remarkable. The problem is capital is limited. So my principal objection to the path we're on is that reality tells you the path we're on isn't going to work to change energy systems, but we know it's costing a lot of money, which is robbing capital away from efforts for resilience, not just political capital, but actual capital. And that, to me, is fundamentally immoral, because if we want to protect our future civilization, our children and grandchildren in the future from the assaults of nature, we should start thinking more clearly about how to spend money and engineering talent on that.
That's a great point. So is it better to spend, we only have X number of resources, it's not limited. Is it better to spend those resources on a few percent reduction in emissions in the West only that are going to be overridden by China, or is it better to spend it on mitigation?
And that is in the real world.
That's a debate. That's a debate I haven't heard.
And that is the actual debate, to use in the real world, that we are implicitly answering. We are implicitly answering that question right now. Our policies have made the decision that we're going to spend the precious dollars, because all dollars are limited. You can only print so many, and then you just inflate your way to craziness.
Right.
We're spending it on a path that will not achieve the goal it's claimed.
Right.
We know that. So why not spend those precious dollars on the two other things, which I like, which is betting on the unpredictable, which is new science. We've got to put more effort into that, which is not subsidies of yesterday's technologies. It's subsidies for the researchers of the future. I want more graduate students who are interested in chemistry, catalysis, and physics and mechanical engineering to get the same money that they would have got if they went into computing science. What's happening now is we're finding computer scientists. Okay, great. I love computer scientists, but there's no money in the basic sciences, really.
Right.
And so students are wisely choosing to go into fields that have more money. This is something the wave of the pen can fix. You want more chemists and physicists? You can get those, pay them more when they come out of undergraduate or grad school, and they'll go there. That governments can do that, and they can allocate more money to mitigation or resilience. And mitigation in the sense of mitigating impacts. It's a choice that's being made by default, and we're not having the debate. And the debate is being, to your point earlier, about being able to have this conversation. Even having that conversation
is canceled.
It's not a conversation that's being had because no one wants to have that conversation. They all want to pretend. IEA keeps saying we have to double down. Okay. I'll double down on lithium production to get more electric cars in the world. But, let's be honest about it. Most electric cars are not significantly reducing carbon dioxide emissions. We just know that as a fact.
Right.
Depending on where the lithium and the cobalt and the copper and nickel are produced, they might actually increase carbon dioxide.
And the electricity is produced. Yeah.
And depending on where electricity is produced, but also depending on where the batteries are made.
Yeah.
We might actually net increase global CO2 emissions. But as a minimum, we have no idea. This is the problem. We have no idea. We really don't have any idea whether it's leading to a reduction or not in global carbon dioxide emissions in the next decade. But we do know it's costing money. We do know that.
Yeah.
Taxpayers' money, citizens' money.
And that's real money. That means something else is given up.
It's absolutely.
Either my children's future or money for NASA or money for teachers or whatever. Money is not unlimited. So, Mark, this is amazing. Thank you so much for this time. I think you and I could talk for hours. I really appreciate it.
Good to be back on your the launch of the great 2023 Terry Virts podcast, and I'm flattered to have been the one to kick off the new year. Thank you.
I've got a new background. There's going to be more changes to the background, so things are in work here.
Well, I like the helmet. First of all, I like the astronaut and the shuttle.
I like it.
I should put in my background some of my new robot toys next time.
Yeah. Well, we were talking about robotics.
Good.
Well, we'll do this again, Mark. And again, if you like the podcast, please subscribe and give us a rating. If you don't like the podcast, don't worry about giving us a rating. So
same page, brother.
Exactly. We'll talk to you later, Mark.
Take care, Terry.